All right, everyone, and we are back. Welcome. In today's video, we will embark on a journey to uncover the mysterious forces that might be pulling the strings behind the scenes, controlling our world, and exploring various power players from mega banks to tech giants, international organizations like the WEF, World Economic Forum, and but really, the plot twist is there's a single entity controlling them all. In other words, we will be talking about the United Nations, right? The United Nations are basically a conglomerate of most powerful countries in the world that all come together to make decisions. Let's get into the history of the United Nations. So the United Nations is an intergovernment organization whose stated purpose is to maintain international peace, security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, serve as essential for harmonizing actions of nations. It is the largest international organization. The UN is headquartered in New York City, and the organization has its offices in Geneva. I don't know if you guys remember Geneva from Marvel. Remember, they have the assembly in Civil War, Black Panther, Nairobi, Vienna, and Harras, where the International Court of Justice is headquartered. Just in case you're wondering, this is what the United Nations headquarters looks like. And that is the flag of all the different countries. That's the building, administrative building. It says the Division of Administration of the Department of Operational Supports reminds delegates and staff in New York that, as in the previous years, the cool United Nations summer settings will be in effect mid-September and will cause outside temperatures to start to drop. Now, this is interesting because not too long ago, there was a United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York that nobody talked about. Nobody was aware of for some reason, right? But I actually was a little bit aware. Yes, this meeting opened up in September. That's kind of why I'm bringing this up, because while everybody is worried about the things on TV that they politically talk about, there is always things going on in the background. But let's get into it. Let's get a little bit further. We're going to kick off by examining the major players often associated with global control. Mega banks, asset managers, tech giants are on the radar. We will briefly explore the influences and interests in shaping the world. Next, we'll connect it to the World Economic Trade Forum and go a little bit further on the global agenda of the United Nations. Now, if you know anything about the United Nations, they are very, very heavy into the 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which I've had past videos about that, as far as smart cities, digital IDs, central banking, digital currencies, CBDCs, and an electrical controlled AI society, right? Now, if we get back into why the United Nations was created, after the Napoleonic Wars of the 1800s, powerful entities aimed to establish a period of peace, leading to the creation of the Concert of Europe in 1815. Well, after that, the next thing that was created that leads up to the United Nations is the League of Nations, which was created in 1920, right? But the League of Nations agendas and roles was a little bit different. They were more into human rights and labor and conditions, but they ultimately they crumbled right around World War II in 1939. And that, as you can see, first it was the Concert of Europe in 1815, the League of Nations in 1920, and then the third time proved to be a charm. After World War II in 1945, the United Nations effectively came into being, albeit officially founded a month later. It was created by the major global powers with 50 countries on set. Nowadays, they have 193 countries, all part of the United Nations. So this is important because they're connected to the World International Settlements, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World International Bank, with Microsoft, Open Chat, GPT. All of this all interfaces, which is why we are taking the history into the United Nations now. Now, the United Nations' primary purpose was upholding peace and security worldwide, also to explore multifaceted goals laid out in the United Nations Funding Charter, extending beyond peacekeeping to humanitarian efforts and fostering international cooperation on global issues, right? The United Nations mission aligns with the pursuit of global solutions and a single global government. Achieving entails the prerequisites like a united global currency and military. I don't know, a lot of people notice the United Nations has its own military. So if the World Economic Trade Forum has its own police and the United Nations has its own military, don't you think people should be just a little bit more worried about them? Perhaps even more than our local or major government. Because if you go read the logs and some of the meetings that they have, you will see state governors like Greg Abbott. No, yes, Greg Abbott and other people, including our Texas governor and other states' governments and senators that have to take meetings at the United Nations and the WEF, World Economic Trade Forum. Now, if you're connecting all of that with between a one world government and a one world currency, right? It seems like they're trying to have what some would call a global governance, right? Now, as we dive into the history of the United Nations military involvement, starting to establish in 1948, it was initially focused for peacekeeping missions, and the United Nations military purpose expanded significantly after the Cold War, moving beyond keeping nations in check and keeping people under control. Now, the United Nations announcement of a digital army aimed at combating misinformation and disinformation. This move represents a bordered effect to control information, particularly content of those in power found unfavorably. As we discuss the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, consisting of the 17 global objectives, I've read those out. I have a video on that. It says there's a looming deadline by 2030 to implement digital ID, central banking DCs, CBDCs, and smart cities across the world. As that timeline continues to tick forward, the emphasis and the urgency for global push to expedite this implementation are being expedited exponentially, which means accelerated, right? But first, knowing that these things are being pushed, we would want to know who are the people that are pulling the strings behind the scenes. So we explore the 6 key UN organs, focusing on the General Assembly and the Security Council, right? The General Assembly is comprised of representatives from all 193 United States member countries. Every September, they gather to discuss and vote on resolutions. We distinguish between important resolutions, which requires 2/3 of the majority, and less significant ones that need a simple majority, right? Then we have the Security Council, which features 15 countries, with 5 of them holding a permanent seat, while the remaining 10 rotate every 2 years. So there's 5 that are permanent and then 10 that are rotated every 2 years. The permanent 5, with no surprise, would be France, Russia, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom, right? The permanent 5, or P5, nations possess the power of veto over important UN resolutions. This privilege allows them to block any resolution that could negatively affect their interests. We uncover the controversy and history behind the powerful tool. Example, right? When the United States attempted to pass a resolution in the United Nations to invade Iraq after 9/11, the resolution was rejected. Yet the United States proceeded with the invasion anyway, which shows that, hey, as we all know, the United Nations, the United States knows how to drag their nuts on the cement and continue to move in their power dynamics how they want. In other words, nobody can check us. Now, that might cause problems in the future and has, because as we've gone forward, China and Russia have decided that they're not a fan of that and done different things to shake that up. But the leader of the Secretary Secret Group, nominated by the Security Council, elected by the General Assembly every 10 years, they call it the Secretary General, right? The Secretary General does not have a term limit, but none have served more than two limits, right? If we explore the history of the secret elections, uncover who truly guides the United Nations ships. A significant transformation occurred in the UN in the early 1990s. These changes have lasting implications for the power dynamics within the organization. Shedding light on that, right, we emphasize the democratic nature of the UN's voting process, or supposed. Every member, regardless of financial contribution, is supposed to have an equal vote in the UN's future. Balance and the power within the United Nations seemed to be shifting in the developing countries in the 1990s. This shift didn't sit well with the United States and its allies, as it threatened to influence on the global stage, right? So, we trace the history of the Secretary Generals since the 1990s and how these alignments with the United States interests played a pivotal role in the organization's trajectory, right? Going forward, right? The connection to the Secretary General is connected to some of the entities I've talked about before: World Economic Trade Forum, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, have a significant influence on the United Nations agenda. They are the driving of the sustainable development and ensuring ESG criteria, which was introduced by the Kenyan president, I think around 2003 or five of that nature, right? These international regulators organizations shape the public and private sectors alike, from selecting potential future leaders at the global and local levels, offering loans to developing countries that comply with the SDGs, sustainable development. In other words, what I am saying is the International Monetary Fund and the World International Bank only allow some of these countries, they only give money or allow some of these countries to join the UN if they follow their sustainable, smart grid, smart cities, digital ID, and CBDCs, and also, some would say, experimental vaccine trials. If you're able to put that in between the line, you would understand what that means. I can't go too further in that in this video. I don't want no strikes because, YouTube don't play no games, it seems. So, interestingly enough, there's an intricate global dynamic that results in a very few developing countries transitioning to developed status over the past half century. The interest of the United States and its ally plays a significant role in that outcome, with countries like South Korea and Taiwan aligning with those interests, right? There's been a noticeable reluctance among UN member states to openly challenge the status quo. High-profile addresses at the UN General Assembly are limited to around 15 minutes. So, because of the United States, World Economic Trade Forum, IMF, World International Banks, and major corporations, when other countries at the General Assembly, they try not to have too much criticism on the United States and their allies. Some will remember the famous speech by Libyan Prime Minister Muammar Gaddafi, who dared to challenge the norm. Gaddafi's fate reveals the consequences of disturbing the established order. As we all know, he was murdered and assassinated. I don't know if some people saw that video where Hillary Clinton said, "We came, we conquered, and he's dead." Not spending no propaganda. This is what happened. Leaders like Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin have opted for a more discreet diplomacy in recent years. They've often sent their top diplomats to the United Nations annual assemblies instead of speaking themselves. The absence of their speeches from the United Nations official video raises questions. Thankfully, these speeches are available elsewhere on YouTube, offering an alternate perspective on global affairs. Jinping in the 2015 address emphasized the inevitability of a multipolar world. China positioned itself as an alternate to the United States-led international order, inviting developing countries to follow its path to prosperity. Putin's speech echoed similar sentiments, emphasizing the need for the United Nations to adapt to a changing world. So, in other words, as of now, it seems like the United States, China, and Russia are kind of fighting it out for the power of the United Nations in the long run. Putin highlighted that the increasing use of sanctions as an economical war to eliminate competitors, the strategy has been leveraged not only by Russia, but other powerful countries to exert control on the global stage. Both Jinping, Vladimir Putin's speeches challenged the established order, and this might explain why their addresses were deleted from the United Nations YouTube channel. These leaders represent powerful countries that serve on the United UN Security Council, making their sentiment significant and potentially disruptive. Now, it says the UN's track record shows that it has often failed to achieve its goals, with financial constraints, external crises acting as a significant roadblock. The transition from the Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 marked the first attempt to address global issues. Recent years have seen increased tensions among major United Nations member states, particular to the United Nations, China, particularly to the United States, China, and Russia. These power struggles have hindered the United Nations' ability to coordinate global policies effectively, including the implementation of sustainable development goals. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres acknowledged that the changing dynamics within the organization. Antonio Guterres expressed concerns on the potential withdrawal of the United States from the UN or reducing its funding. In other words, they're afraid that if the United States reduces its funding or moves around, that could cause the United Nations to fail or other people to leave, right? As we all know, when Donald Trump was president, he threatened to leave the United Nations, and it kind of put a lot of things into tension. The United Nations intensified focus on digital issues such as cybersecurity, digital governments, and is indicative to a desperate energy to maintain control on the narrative, while the official stance is to be moved to unrelated human rights and reflects the United Nations anxiety over loss of influence. Now, there are private sector partnerships, right? These partnerships, right, are the same entities I've been saying as long as the World Economic Trade Forum, IMF, the World International Bank, the FATF, right, which has actually checked countries in the past that have not rolled with the United States agenda in terms of funding. So they've said, hey, we're not going to help you economics and we're not going to fund you if you guys don't listen to what the general narrative is. Now, with that, right, leaving the United Nations isn't as simple as it sounds. The way that the United Nations was built and the way that the charter is, it lacks provisions for member countries to withdraw, primarily preventing political blackmail and evade obligations. Historical examples is when, back in the 1933, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, which caused a lot of other countries to withdraw. Surprisingly, some countries that seem eager to leave the UN generally don't. Those countries would be Russia and China, which means as much mess and trash as they talk, they don't seem to be going anywhere. But they do seem to, in the future, want to be using groups like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. I have a video on that as a potential competitor to the United Nations, which is interesting because, again, Goldman and Sachs, who's backed by BlackRock, funded the BRICS group. So I give all these videos for people to understand. This is a big, giant play, role, or movie where they're saying one thing to us but doing another, right? One of the most important things upcoming is there will be a new election for the Secretary General, right? Antonio agrees set to end in 2027, which means there will be new Attorney General, which could either push the sustainable development goals forward or hold them back. And then going in that, there's also a rumor that, hey, the United Nations is going bankrupt. Once upon a time, 2 world wars saw a bunch of stuff get blown up and millions die. After the dust settled, countries decided it may be a better idea to meet and talk about their differences instead of fighting. They called their meetings the United Nations, and it was a trumping success. For the most part, world peace is one less thing to worry about for investors. Now, 193 nations now vote at the UN for changes they want to see in the world. The United Nations peace word is peace, not profit, but it does not need money to survive. And it does charge a couple $2 billion at the door. Every member has a chip in it. But predictably, somewhat, the United Nations finance man, Antonio Gross, is losing sleep over 64 countries that won't cough up a 30% underfunded budget. And the United States is tired of having to pull the slack. The United Nations is not magically funded out of the goodwill. It's never been paid a penny for disarming dictators, driving climate reform, or sanction international bad apples. The United Nations cannot pay for what it can afford, which is now staff wages. And some would say the United Nations is on the verge of people's stockpiles looking at a war-driven defense as Iranian-based systems, Northrop Grumman, and the world's police threatening to go burst. If Syria will pay, but then Saudi Arabia won't, it is a divided world with the United Group of Nations. Some countries probably have more or less short-term than others to gain from this. On the other hand, don't be surprised if the Saudis find a couple billion under the sofa if the war breaks out. But by that time, most players will cash out in their defense stocks anyway. Now, what that means, right? And I'll read this last thing, and we will be at the end. It says, following a United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres remarks the launch of a world debt report. Half the world is sinking in development disaster fueled by crisis debit. That is the main message of the report we are presented today. And this report was in July 12, 2023, 3 months before the General Assembly meeting, right? It says 3.3 billion, almost half of humanity lives in countries that spends more on debt, interest paying than education or health. And yet, because most unsustainable debts are concentrated in poor countries, they are not judged to pose a systemic risk of global financial system. This mirage of 3.3 billion is more systematic. It's a systematic failure. Markets may seem not to be suffering yet, but the people are. And it says the International Monetary Fund said 36 countries are so-called debt row, either in a high risk of debt distress. Another 16 are paying unsustainable interest to private creditors. Now, what this all means, people, and we are now at the end of the video, what this all means is that in the long run, things are moving fast. Between the United Nations, the World Economic Trade Forum, the World International Bank, IMF, International Monetary Fund, the FAF, and other organizations that are ruling things as of now, countries are starting to therefore either break out or say, how does this benefit me going down the road? Or are they? Is this what they say it is? Is this finally the great reset, the financial crash that will change the world for the better, bring humanity into the forefront and evolve into its true potential? Or is this the start of a Big Brother, Matrix, Blade Runner, Terminator, iRobot, Total Recall, Minority Report society? As it tells from the economics and the technological advances, it would seem so. And as these things are happening, I make these videos stuttering and all on some of these things, to allow people to know that the things that you're paying attention to, whether it be Sexy Red in Pound Town, Cardi B, Will Smith, Jada Pinkett Smith, and all these other things, are a distraction. And some would say it's time to start paying attention to these unvoted and unsanctioned groups across the world that control the education, health, financial, and economical aspects of your life. Right? This all connects to cryptocurrency, CBDCs, the blockchain, and the quantum financial system, which some say may be for good and some may be for bad. And on that, I am checking out. This is Kal-El. I am a futurist. I do cryptocurrency advisories, technology, NFTs, metaverses, and therefore, after, my job, if any, is to allow you to understand that the things that you should be paying attention to that really affect your world are right in front of you. As I always say, you either get in front of history or you become a victim from it. And I will also say there's nothing new under the sun. And so if there's nothing new that's under the sun, the only thing that can be new to you is your perspective, your understanding, your awareness, and your fire, drive, and desire to make the world a better place for you or yourself, but not just in your own reality, but a reality in general. This is Kal-El, and I'm signing out.